I'm really pleased to be here in Limerick to see how the city is so beautiful, being restored. Before I speak about Russia, which is going to be my theme tonight, I'd like to say a few words about someone who deserves some of the credit for the good things that have happened in Limerick. I'm referring to the great philanthropist Chuck Feeney, who did so much to make the University of Limerick a world-class educational institution. I've kept in touch with Chuck since I wrote his biography some years ago. And I can tell you he was very distressed to learn of the death of his very good friend, Micheál O'Sullivan, who traveled with him around the world, to Cuba and other places. It was Chuck's funding that enabled Micheál O'Sullivan to found the Irish World Academy of Music and Dance at UCL. I came here with him for the opening of the Academy in 2011, and I never saw Chuck Feeney happier. Limerick was his favourite project in the whole world. As you know, he's a frugal man. He never owned a limo or flew in a private plane, and he always came to Limerick by train. And on his last visit here, and he loves to tell the story, the train stopped in the middle of nowhere, and he said the conductor came through the carriage to announce to everyone, the engine is banjaxed. That was his last visit. Unfortunately now, Chuck lives in San Francisco. He's in a wheelchair, but he still is very interested in everything that's going on in the world. And he told me how very sad he was and what a great loss for Ireland was the death of Micheál O'Sullivan. I'd like to talk about how I see the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of today's nationalist Russia through the perspective of my own experiences and with some personal tales and reminiscences that might provide some insight. I was the Irish Times correspondent in Moscow from 1987 to 1991. That was the year when Mikhail Gorbachev, the last Soviet leader, gave the keys of the Kremlin to Boris Yeltsin, the first president of independent Russia. Some of you here are old enough to remember when Gorbachev's plane stopped over at Shannon to refuel on the way to a summit with George H.W. Bush. Gorbachev insisted it wasn't a stopover but a milestone in Irish-Soviet relations, which was a bit of a stretch. I was on that trip, and at a press conference here in Shannon, I addressed Gorbachev in the formal manner, which is name and patronymic. So when I began my question by saying Mikhail Sergeyevich, and afterwards a Dublin colleague said to me, "By God, Conor, you must know him shocking well to call him by his first name." At least Gorbachev got off the plane, which is more than Boris Yeltsin did a few years later at Shannon, much to the dismay of Albert Reynolds and the #1 Army band waiting for him on the tarmac. On the way here, I was thinking about how we correspondents in Moscow during the Cold War were isolated and cut off from the rest of the world. We had no internet in those days. That was the late 1980s. We had no satellite or mobile phones. In fact, we had no direct dial phones. We had to go through international operators. If my office wanted to call me from Dublin, they had to use the international operator. And I was then just about the only Irishman in Moscow. That was before the invasion of Limerick people to service the duty-free shops that Arienta set up there. The international operators got to know me very well. And one day, Gareth Fitzgerald, he liked to tell the story. He asked the international operator to contact me. He asked the international operator to connect him to my number in Moscow. And he didn't say who he was calling, and he didn't give his own name. And the operator said, "I'm sorry, Garrett, but Conor's not there today." That's how small the world was and how intimate communications were in those years. Now, much of what's happening in Russia today and what has gone wrong can be traced to the awful deprivations and humiliation of Russia in those last years of the USSR and the immediate aftermath. A few years ago, I researched and wrote a book on the last day of the Soviet Union called Moscow, the 25th of December 1991. What struck me very forcibly then was it was such a high watermark in relations between the Kremlin and the West. Relations between Moscow and Washington were never better before or since. It was such a pivotal day in our history. It was the day Gorbachev resigned and the red flag came down from the Kremlin. It was the day the country that defeated Hitler simply ceased to exist, and Russia escaped from the cul-de-sac into which Lenin had led it 74 years earlier. And the most extraordinary thing, on that day, the Kremlin was swarming with American journalists, dozens of them, recording Gorbachev's every word and gesture. When Gorbachev went to sign his resignation statement, his Soviet pen didn't work and he had to borrow a Mont Blanc from one of the dozens of CNN people crowded into the room. Well, why were there no Russian journalists? They were with the new man, Boris Yeltsin. No one was interested in Gorbachev anymore. They had only contempt for him. Gorbachev, a sophisticated, good man, a genuine reformer, revered in the West, was viewed in Russia through the prism of the hardships associated with his presidency and the shame. Imagine, in his last year in office, Red Cross workers were distributing parcels to pensioners, food parcels around Moscow, provided by Germany. Yeltsin, ironically despised as an ignorant buffoon in the West, was the person who actually broke up the Soviet Union. Actually, I believe he was, at that time, a genuine Democrat. And he also had a sense of humor. When John Major asked him to describe, in one word, what's the condition of Russia, he said, good. And Major asked him, how would you describe it in 2 words? He said, not good. It was quite extraordinary. When the Soviet Union was breaking up, George H.W. Bush and his foreign minister, George Baker, went round all the countries that were becoming independent, including Russia, and demanded that as the price of recognition by the United States, they would have to sign up to 5 principles of democracy, and they all did. That was how influential America was at that moment in time. Yeltsin set out to convince world leaders that they should help him to dismantle communism, and very quickly, because he was afraid that communists might come back. This is where my wife comes into the picture, as she became part of an international project to drag Russia into the modern world. My wife is Zhana Suvorova, an Armenian born in Grozny and brought up in Krasnoyarsk, a closed city in Siberia, where she was an assistant professor of linguistics. I've actually just published a book on her family called The Shoemaker and His Daughter. She was brought up as a model Soviet child, believing in the system, believing in what she taught, what she was taught, revering Lenin. She was a member of the Communist Party. She was a deputy in the Parliament of Krasnoyarsk region, which is 6 times the size of France. We met in Moscow when she took a career break to do her doctorate, and that was about 4 years before the Soviet Union collapsed. And our time together there coincided with the period when Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, or openness, was revealing uncomfortable truths about communism. She began to see the world through my eyes, and I began to see Russia through her eyes, so it was an educational process for both of us. Glasnost was meant to create an open and productive society. That was Gorbachev's intention. It was a disaster for the Communist Party. Long suppressed films and books exposed the crimes of Stalin and Lenin and the true abysmal state of the country. Soviet citizens learned that the communist paradise was based on lies. I personally believe that the freedom given to movie makers, playwrights, writers, and journalists helped more than anything to destroy the idea that communist Soviet Union had a future. One movie Jean and I went to see was personally authorized by Gorbachev to show the need for reforms, but I can personally testify it had the effect of people leaving the cinema furious at the way they were forced to live. It was called Tak Jit Nelzya, One Cannot Live Like This, and it was aimed at revealing the Soviet Union to be impoverished, criminalized, and morally bankrupt. And Gorbachev's reason for having this film released was that it would show people the need for the reforms that he was bringing in. I remember the film had scenes of ill-tempered queues at empty shops, long queues, which were juxtaposed with people strolling around a well-stocked Hamburg shopping mall. And the narrator said, "We spend our lives looking at each other's backs." That's how I remember it. Queues for everything and nothing in the shops. People made wry jokes. An absent-minded old man finds himself outside a supermarket with an empty shopping bag, and he can't remember whether he's done his shopping or not. Even Gorbachev used to tell an anecdote against himself concerning the shortage of vodka. An exasperated man in a long, long queue for vodka said, "Right, I'm going to the Kremlin to shoot Gorbachev." But he soon came back saying there was a longer queue there. Like millions of Soviet citizens, Jana became deeply disillusioned with the party, especially in her case, when we discovered that the grounds of a ruined city monastery where we loved to go on a Sunday afternoon actually contained the bodies of thousands of Stalin's victims, and nobody had known before that. Stalin's crimes were generally known, but they were fully exposed by the opening of secret Communist Party archives by Gorbachev with his policy of openness. And one archive caused a great shock. It was a resolution of the Politburo signed by Stalin ordering the execution of 26,000 Polish officers at Katyn Forest just before the outbreak of the Second World War, or just at the start. Even Gorbachev had continued the fiction of blaming the Germans. Incidentally, in the archives, I came across a document of Irish interest. It outlined a plan, this is 1972, it outlined a plan cobbled up by the KGB chief Yuri Andropov to send a ship with German arms to the official IRA by sinking the arms in a package in the Irish Sea to be picked up later by a trawler. And it was a response to a request from Irish Communist Party leader Michael O'Riordan, who was in contact with the official IRA. I was never able to establish whether the guns were actually dumped in the Irish Sea or whether they were collected. The KGB. I've had a few encounters with the Soviet spy agency. Despite Gorbachev's reforms, the KGB remained in Cold War mode. And indeed, as we rejoiced, and Muscovites rejoiced in the new freedoms of the press and freedoms of speech and freedoms of assembly in those last years of the USSR, the KGB was planning a coup against Gorbachev to restore a Stalinist regime. They were also spying on Western journalists like myself, and they also were very interested in contacts between Western journalists and Soviet citizens. So there was me in contact with a Soviet citizen, and this is where it became personal. Their surveillance established that Jana and I were seeing a lot of each other. And one day an agent showed up at Jana's university, said, "I want you to come for a walk with me." Took her out in the street where nobody could hear what they were saying. And he told her that as a good Soviet citizen, she should be willing to help them against those who might harm the motherland. He wanted her to get me to accept one of their agents as a friend who would help me in my work, but would obviously compromise me in some way. And he wanted her to report on conversations with other foreigners with whom we were socializing. And looking back, I am actually not surprised, because some of these foreigners included people who had put up red flags for the KGB. One of them was a close friend, Zan Smiley, the correspondent of the Daily Telegraph, whose father was a British intelligence officer and the model for the spy master called George Smiley of the John le Carré novels. Another was Rupert Cornwell of the London Independent, who was a half-brother of John le Carré, himself a former MI6 officer. So 3 times, Jana refused. She said, "No, I won't spy, I won't report on my friends or their conversations." So they said, we'll talk to you again. 3 times they approached her, and the 3rd time they became threatening. They said, "If you don't cooperate with us, we will block your PhD and we'll ban you from Moscow." Everybody in those days who were Soviet citizens needed a propiska, a piece of paper, to live in Moscow. If you didn't have it, you couldn't stay there. For a time, we were in real fear of what they would do. Obviously, I couldn't write about this. We worried that if if it became public, that there could be repercussions for Jana, for her family, for me, because it wasn't unknown for the Soviet Union to throw out Western correspondence for whatever reason. But they didn't carry out their threat. We got married in Moscow in 1989, and the KGB gave Jana up as a lost cause. And thankfully, the coup against Gorbachev in August 1991 collapsed and actually hastened the end of the Soviet Union. Incidentally, if I can digress, this wasn't my first brush with the KGB. Sometime before that, before I went to Moscow, I was news editor of the Irish Times in Dublin, and one of my owner's tasks was to take people to lunch, including the cultural attaché of the American embassy and the TASS correspondent in Dublin, the correspondent of the Soviet News Agency TASS. He was the only Russian correspondent in Dublin. He was called Mikhail Smirnov, a very appropriate name. Mikhail Smirnov and I were due to meet for lunch at Coffer's restaurant in Temple Bar. And I met him as he was getting out of his car, and he said, "Your special branch, they follow me everywhere." And I said, "How do you know?" He said, "Well, there they are. There's those two men in that car. They followed me from my house." I said, "How do you know they were following you?" He said, "I go up a cul-de-sac, they go up a cul-de-sac." So I went over to the car and I knocked on the window and I said, "You can take a couple of hours off, we'll be in Coffer's restaurant." And they weren't too pleased. Anyway, Mikhail went back eventually to Russia, and a few years after that, a Soviet defector called Gordievsky, there's a book just been published about him recently. He was a top spy for MI6. He was based in London, and the British Embassy smuggled him out of Moscow whenever they copped on that he was a spy for the KGB. He wrote a book, and he named all the KGB agents in Western Europe. And I got the book and I looked up the index, and there it said, Smirnov, Mikhail, acting KGB chief, Dublin, 1982-1986. So to get back to the story of how Jana became involved in the project to privatize Russia. In 1991, I was transferred from Moscow to Washington to cover the White House. And there, Jana was recruited by the World Bank to a small team of consultants being put together at the request of Yeltsin to provide a model of how capitalism worked. The team was mainly American consultants, but the person, it's actually an Irish guy called Michael O'Farrell, who's a lot of associations with Limerick. He worked for the World Bank, and he wanted somebody Russian who could speak Russian and who knew something about how Russia worked, and he recruited Jana for this small group of consultants. So she was recruited at the request to put together this small group of economists at the request of Yeltsin to provide a model of how capitalism might work. So when you think about it, just as Peter the Great looked to the West to modernize Tsarist Russia, here was Boris Yeltsin looking to the West to help save post-communist Russia. Russia was in a terrible state. In researching my book on the last day of the Soviet Union, I interviewed Igor Gaidar, who was the deputy prime minister and responsible for the freeing of prices. I asked him, in his own experience, on the last day of the Soviet Union, how bad things were. He said, "I'll tell you." He said, there was no food in the shops. My wife and young son were queuing for bread in a shop in central Moscow. My son got the last loaf, he said. A woman reached from behind and snatched it out of his hand. He said that's how bad things were. So the task of reconstructing Russia was immense. Remember, almost everything in Russia was owned by the state. The land, the mines, the factories, the banks, the apartment blocks, the shops, the trams, everything, right down to the kiosk at the corner of the street. So Yeltsin had the problem of how to privatize everything very quickly. And he decided to make the city of Nizhny Novgorod, northeast of Moscow, a model for the new capitalist society. Because his district governor, Boris Nemtsov, was a brilliant young Democrat and reformer. And he was very enthusiastic about doing things quickly. So a team of bank officials moved in to start the experiment of how to sell off state assets. And Jana found herself traveling back to Russia as a consultant for the World Bank, and she worked closely with Boris Nemtsov in helping to draw up a blueprint for other cities to copy. In fact, Nemtsov's daughter came to stay with us in Washington a couple of times. Nemtsov's model worked, at least at the start, and the model worked this way. Everybody was given a voucher worth about $20. In fact, everybody in Russia was eventually given a voucher. And these vouchers could be used, you could sell them to somebody who could collect them, and then to go to an auction and could bid for the enterprise, whether it be a cheese shop or a car manufacturing plant. So the model worked, at least at the start. Vouchers were issued to all the citizens in Nizhny Novgorod to bid at auction, and the city was privatized fairly quickly. So the World Bank compiled a small book about how it worked, and this was sent to every city in Russia. Well-connected Russians, however, figured out how to buy up vouchers and become capitalists overnight, and a few emerged as the oligarchs we know of today. In fact, the aluminium factory in Krasnoyarsk was the second biggest in the world. A man called Bykov, who managed to get some money, stood at the gate of the factory and he bought vouchers from everybody coming for work. They all had their $20 vouchers. And before the year was out, he was an oligarch because he owned the aluminium factory, which were worth many hundreds of millions of dollars. Well-connected Russians became capitalists overnight. And meanwhile, the Russian ruble collapsed, inflation soared, crime and corruption became rampant, and savings became worthless. And the new enterprise owners, stuck with old machinery and tools, couldn't pay wages. It was a terrible time for ordinary people. My wife's sister, Larissa, was a director of a music school in Krasnoyarsk, and she was paid sometimes in food. This was over a year and a half, sometimes with anything that they could give her. Once they gave her a box of men's socks in lieu of her salary. As Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, everything the communists told about communism was a lie. Unfortunately, everything the communists told us about capitalism turns out to be true. Privatization, he noted, was enacted with the same blind madness, the same destructive haste as collectivization in the 1930s. And overnight, this generation of brash, rich Russians emerged and began traveling to the West, flouting their new wealth as if there was no tomorrow. The story went that one of these new Russians asked another, "How much did you pay for that Rolex watch?" And the other said, $5,000. He said, "You fool, I know you can get it for $6,000. While this was going on, George H.W. Bush, friend of Gorbachev, called each other by the first name, promised that he wouldn't gloat in the fall of the Soviet Union, was telling Congress to the cheers of Republicans and Democrats, by the grace of God, America won the Cold War. And imagine how patriotic Russians, taught to be proud of their country's achievements, felt on hearing that. And the United States at that time was also intent on making sure that their model would be adopted in the United States. They made certain promises to the new Russian leaders. And the love affair soured when these promises weren't kept. For example, there was a verbal promise not to expand NATO to Russia's borders, which eventually happened. And resentment grew in Russia that there was no Marshall Plan to rescue their defeated country, like that which revived a devastated Germany after the Second World War. Interestingly, we're all aghast these days at Russian interference in the US presidential election. It's worth remembering that the Russian 1996 presidential election, Yeltsin was standing for re-election, and this friend of the West was expected to lose. So Americans descended in Moscow in great numbers to help him. The World Bank provided new loans, and an avalanche of television ads was created for Soviet television by the US PR firm of Ogilvy and Macher. So Russians remember the immediate aftermath of communism as a great humiliation. made worse by Yeltsin's increasingly obvious drunkenness. There was a great yearning for a leader who would restore the country's dignity and bring stability. By the late 1990s, Yeltsin was clearly unable to govern anymore. He was sick and he was growing feeble. He told Bill Clinton he planned to make Boris Nemtsov, who had become deputy prime minister, the next president of Russia. He wasn't going to finish his term and he would hand over to Boris Nemtsov. But when Yeltsin finally stepped down through illness in 1999, he handed the remains of his presidency not to the democratically minded Nemtsov, but to Vladimir Putin, former KGB agent, head of the FSB, the spy agency which replaced the KGB. I believe that there was a deal done. The deal was, in return for power, Putin promised not to prosecute members of Yeltsin's family and charge it of rampant corruption. As Putin began to cut back on free press and political opposition and all forms of civil society, Boris Nemtsov became the official leader of the opposition, challenging Putin's rolling back of Russia's new freedoms. And this was a very courageous role to undertake. People considered enemies of the Kremlin began to find themselves dead. There's now a long list, including in 2004, the American correspondent Paul Klebnikov, who was researching oligarch corruption. In 2006, the journalist Anna Politkovskaya, who was investigating the behavior of Russian troops in Chechnya. The former spy Alexander Litvinenko, who was poisoned in London, and you all know the circumstances. In 2009, the lawyer Sergei Magnitsky, and a prominent human rights lawyer Stanislav Markelov, and many journalists who aren't so high profile as Anna Politkovskaya. And more recently, there was an attempt on the life of Skripals in Wiltshire. There was actually one attempted assassination here in Ireland, which I personally witnessed. In November 2006, the day after Litvinenko died, Igor Gaidar, who had also become a strong critic of Putin, came to Maynooth to speak at a conference on Russia. In the middle of his speech, Gaidar collapsed on the floor in front of us, vomiting blood. He was rushed to hospital. He went back to Moscow and he recovered. But his doctors and his family claimed to this day that he was poisoned. And other prominent reformers like Anatoly Chubais link the incident of the killings of Politkovskaya and Litvinenko to what happened to Gaidar here in Ireland. The assassination that affected us personally came on the 3rd of March 2015. On that day, Boris Nemtsov, with whom Jana had worked, was gunned down right outside the Kremlin, 5 bullets in his back, just a day before he was to make public a report exposing Russia as the aggressor in Western Ukraine's dirty war. The Kremlin had been harassing Nemtsov by every means. Before that, Nemtsov had created a political party called Yabloko, which means apple, and he was challenging the increasing authoritarian, undemocratic regime in the Kremlin. Now, it was a properly registered party because there's a veneer of democracy in today's Russia, but it was blocked at every turn. I know this from the experience of Jana's sister, Larissa. Larissa signed up to canvass for Nemtsov's party in the 2007 parliamentary elections. When she went to the party office, which was conveniently located 100 kilometers outside the city, she found it was locked up. She was arrested by the police, well, not arrested, detained, taken to the police station. Her passport was photographed, and she was told to go home and not to be disturbing the stability of the country by voting for somebody other than the Putin's party. From frequent visits, there have been allegations of fraud in subsequent presidential elections. And Aid tells Putin his good news and his bad news. The good news is you've just won the election. The bad news is nobody voted for you. Well, actually, the truth is Putin is actually quite popular. He undoubtedly won the popular vote, partly through the manipulation I just explained to you of the democratic process, but partly because he has restored pride in the country. I visit Russia fairly frequently, about once every 18 months, and I can tell you that people, by and large, accept the Kremlin's narrative of international events, and that the world is out to do down Russia, and that Putin has made Russia great again. But the economy is floundering, and the interesting question now is whether the need for modernization, which is lagging way behind that of China. Russia was far in advance of China 20 years ago, and now it's way behind. In terms of infrastructure, there isn't no bullet trains in Russia, and they're everywhere in China. And whether this, the need for modernization and Western investment pushes Putin and Russia towards re-establishing closer links with the West, rather than risk any serious rift, that's an interesting question. The experience of Janna's family in the transition of the last 3 decades is typical of many former Soviet citizens. Janna's father was a shoemaker. He was a very successful shoemaker, and he made shoes on the side for party members and for people who wanted a decent pair of shoes. Shoes in the Soviet Union were of such inferior quality that if somebody got a trip abroad, the first thing they did was went to a shoe shop. He and his family, they made a good living in Siberia during the best days of communism, which were in the 1970s, when people could make a decent living, before it all fell apart. And why, you might wonder, were these Armenians from the Bamy Caucasus living in Siberia? Well, it happens because when they're living in the city of Grozny, in northern Caucasus, Janna's father sold his car for a profit and was jailed for 7 years, was sentenced to 7 years in jail for the crime of speculation. And to escape the disgrace, he moved his family to Siberia to make a new start. How ironic for him, with capitalism the new religion, he was imprisoned for doing something that is now at the very heart and soul of the new Russia. Janna's parents were actually hopeful that the World Bank model for privatization would mean collective ownership of the Krasnoyarsk shoe factory where they both worked. However, the director bought up all the vouchers of the 800 workers and promptly sacked everyone and sold the building and retired a rich man. On top of that, Janna's parents lost their savings twice through hyperinflation and the collapse of the ruble. But in the worst of times, like many thousands, millions of Russians, they had something to fall back on, and that was their dacha deep in the Siberian countryside, where they grew everything that you can imagine in the short Siberian hot summers. Vegetables, fruits, aubergines, herbs, potatoes, tomatoes, everything. And they stocked up with that for the winter, so they're never short. I have an interesting story about the location of their dacha, about north of Krasnoyarsk. It was sited at the edge of a forest. And in the trees, just 100 yards inside the forest, was a hidden nuclear missile silo with a prime nuclear missile. It contained a solid fuel, nuclear-tipped SS-20 missile capable of reaching Western Europe. It had an electrified fence and permanent military guards. We now know that in 1983, Russia came close to firing this and hundreds of other missiles of the same type at the West when a NATO exercise was mistaken for an imminent attack on the Soviet Union. And it's only in recent years that we realized that it was the courage of one Russian military official to not to obey an order to retaliate that saved the world from Armageddon. In 1987, Gorbachev and President Ronald Reagan, both aware of how close they had come to this situation, agreed to enact an intermediate-range nuclear forces treaty, specifically to get rid of the medium-range missiles, of which hundreds existed on both sides, and of which one was right behind the Suvorov's dacha. So one day in 1990, soldiers came to remove the SS-20 missile, and they drove it away on an immense flatbed truck. So I went to see for myself the deep concrete silo in which it had been housed. It was about 3 stories deep, and there were steps down and a couple of rooms down below. I found a discarded notice about this size, stating, "Stop, go back, fire will be opened without warning." So I took it back to Ireland, I framed it, and it now hangs in my downstairs toilet in Dublin. Very appropriate. I also found, growing all around this site, a circle of marijuana plants. And think of it, military officials in charge of a nuclear missile, possibly stoned out of their mind. Mind you, I didn't take any of those home with me, I promise. The Russian army came later and blew up the site, so the destruction of this and hundreds of other missile sites could be verified by satellite imagery. So the modern world was made a little bit safer, but was it? Perhaps not for long. Just over 3 weeks ago, on the 20th of October, you may have heard in the news, President Donald Trump declared his intention to withdraw from the treaty that Gorbachev and Bush drew up. He accused Putin of violating the terms of the treaty, which allowed for some missiles to remain. And this is probably true. Putin responded that Russia would not fire missiles first in a nuclear conflict, thank you very much, but would annihilate any adversary, and that Russians killed in such a conflict will go to heaven as martyrs. These are very chilling words. One of the reasons, I believe, why Trump and Putin want to scrap the treaty is China. China is now the 3rd world power, nuclear power, and it's not bound by the treaty. So I'm really worried that we're going to see the start of a new nuclear arms race, in which case God help us. But I'll finish on an upbeat note. Many good things have happened in Russia since the end of the Soviet Union. There's a growing middle class who enjoy a middle class life. Moscow is a fantastic, vibrant city. Earlier this year, Jeanne and I visited our family in Krasnoyarsk, and the city I first saw in communist times, when it was an industrial nightmare, with empty stores, rude shopkeepers, no restaurants, decrepit buildings, prisons everywhere, with barbed wire and watchtowers. Now Krasnoyarsk is a lovely, modern European city, at least in the center. Elegant restaurants and cafes, pleasant service. Everybody has access to high-speed broadband. It's a city where, in my memory, shop assistants used an abacus, to calculate bills. Now people pay their shopping and restaurant accounts with Android Pay on their mobiles. And the prisons, they've all been faced with red brick, and you wouldn't know that there were prisons anymore, and a lot of them been closed down. Krasnoyarsk also has a rugby team, the best in Russia. It hosted Connacht in the first ever European rugby fixture in Russia in 2015. So if Russia's beginning to play rugby, it can't be all that bad. The team's called the Yenisei, after the river which flows through Krasnoyarsk. It came to Galway for a return game. I was there cheering them on. Didn't help them, they lost. And this remote Siberian city now has several Irish pubs, and whether that last is an advance in civilization, I will leave it to others to judge. So all I would say now is thank you for listening to me, and I appreciate you turning out on quite a chilly night to come here. Thank you.
I was taken by one of the last comments that you made, which was to observe on the emergence of the middle class in Russia. From a historical perspective, that's almost the defining momentum in the development of modern Western society. Not so much the triumph of democracy per se, but the emergence of a middle class who create all of these possibilities. Could you just say a bit more about that, Conor, and how that might lead to a radical change in Russian life?
Well, when a middle class grows, they become interested in civic society. There's always been a passivity about the Russian people due to nearly a century of communism and serfdom before that. So you now have, for the first time, the emergence of quite a substantial middle class, maybe 20% of the population now, who want to live like people in the West, who also don't really want to live under an authoritarian society which, where the news is, on television is subservient to the Kremlin. So there's a certain amount of freedom. I'll give you a story about how Russia has changed. A student called Johnny O'Reilly studied Russian in Dublin. In 1992, he went to Russia for his final year, and he stayed. And he became as Russian as the Russians. And he began to make movies in Russian. And I've seen the 2 movies he's made, and they're very critical of corruption in Russia and of Putin. And they've been shown in Russian cinemas. So you could get an impression when I talk about assassinations of enemies of the Kremlin that this is a Stalinist society. It's not. It's gone back a long way in terms of, you know, you can do what you like, you can start a business, you can travel abroad, you can make money, but don't challenge the system, which is borrowed from China, because that's the system in China that keeps the glue that keeps that society together.
Okay. And maybe just before giving people in the audience an opportunity to question, just one more. Maybe could you say something about your assessment of the state of journalism in Russia at the moment? Not so much the media in general, but journalism and how it is coping with a very changing society.
Yeah, journalism, there are newspapers in Moscow which are very lively. The danger for journalists is probing too deeply into corruption, because the mafia, as they're called in Russia, is quite strong. Just recently, about 3 weeks ago, 3 Russian journalists were assassinated in Africa, where they'd gone to inquire into the activities of a Russian oligarch there. It's not uncommon for Russian journalists who are very, very courageous. They're much more, they need a lot of courage to do what they do. For Russian journalists to find themselves falling out of a 5th floor window, that sort of thing. But you listen to, there's a radio station in Moscow called Radio Echo, which is as lively as any radio station here in Ireland, and is critical and is frank and open. And there are newspapers which don't toe the Kremlin line. Television is where the Kremlin has total control. So I would say that a lot of journalists, apart from the very courageous ones, know where to draw the line, know where not to go, which is a measure of an authoritarian state.
Okay. Let's, so David has a roving microphone. This is an opportunity for questions. Emphasis on the word questions rather than statements, please. So David, do you want to?
Conor, my question is about Mikhail Gorbachev. And I've often wondered, what kind of courage does it take to go up against the established, entrenched bureaucracy in your country, especially in the former USSR? And in your opinion, from your time there, was Mikhail Gorbachev a very brave man as such? And also, there's a slight second part to it. Did he have much support from like-minded individuals within the power structure of the USSR? As the impression I always had about him is that he was something of a loner in himself.
Gorbachev was very different from the people that went before. As you know, most of them even older than me. And the country had reached a point of stagnation that they knew they had, the Politburo, the Central Committee, they knew that they had to do something, they had to bring in some sort of reforms because the country was stagnating. And therefore Gorbachev got a good start. Even Yeltsin, who became his bitter foe in the end, even Yeltsin at the beginning, who was a typical Russian apparatchik, he threw his support behind Gorbachev. He had very good support from a number of people in the Politburo, like Shevardnadze, who became foreign minister. Some officials like Chernayev, who has written a very interesting diary about those days. But as time went on, his reforms met a lot of resistance, especially from people running big combines and enterprises. And they began to push back. And the way they pushed back was they held back the goods that they were producing to put pressure on Gorbachev to roll back on the reforms. Because what Gorbachev was doing was he was moving towards democracy. He was moving towards a situation where the power would be taken away from the bosses all around the country, the Soviet bosses. So it did take an awful lot of courage. And I believe that he was a very good man, a very genuine reformer. He did revert back at one stage in the end of 1990 when he was under grave threat from the hardliners. This was 6 months before the coup. And he decided to become a hardliner himself to try and regain control. And he was responsible for not preventing a crackdown in Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia, where many people were killed. By the time the coup came, he was quite isolated, and there was very little sympathy for him. And when he came back after the coup was defeated, Yeltsin was the new man in town, and Gorbachev's authority, his prestige, it ebbed away. And in fact, he became a rather pathetic figure. He kept making edicts that people paid less and less attention to. So, and you know, we respect Gorbachev here. Gorbachev actually wanted to keep the Soviet Union together as a superpower. It was Yeltsin who said, right, let's smash the whole thing up and start again.
Good evening, Conor. Thank you very much for a fantastic take the lid off your time there. Question for you. Have you met Vladimir Putin?
Sorry?
Have you met Putin?
No, I've never met Putin.
And the second question is, could you tell us, in your opinion, what's his overall plan? Is he intent on trying to bring back the former East states, Hungary and Poland and the other places back into his orbit? Or is he trying to break up the EU and provide a counterbalance to the United States? What's your opinion on that, please?
Yeah. I never met him, but one of the two KGB men that interviewed my wife Shanna looked very like him, and we like to think it might have been him, but he was in Germany at the time. Putin, he wants to restore Russia hegemony in what they used to call the near abroad, the countries that used to belong to the Soviet Union, like Georgia. He has inserted Russian military power into Moldova, into Georgia. There's a Soviet military base in Armenia. So he wants these countries to be part of a Russian-dominated economic bloc. In fact, he's tried to set up an economic bloc akin to like the European Union, which doesn't work quite as well, but exists. I think that he's terrified of one thing. He's terrified of an orange revolution as happened in Ukraine. And that's why his agents were in Ukraine trying to stop Ukraine moving towards the European Union at the time of the Orange Revolution. And I really believe that he is essentially a Russian nationalist who is on record as saying that the breakup of the Soviet Union was one of the greatest tragedies, geopolitical tragedies of the 20th century. His taking back of Crimea was very popular. He knows that actions like that actually bring him popularity. So that's where he's at. He's obviously very happy to see the European Union going through a crisis and breaking up. He's obviously very happy to see American politics in a shambles. This suits his purpose. He doesn't want to be, as he sees it, bullied and told to do by the West. There was a time when the United States was able to tell Russia, here's what you should be doing, immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union, and indeed right up through Clinton's period in office. Clinton was so respected, he actually intervened in the row between Azerbaijan and Armenia over the disputed area of Nagorno-Karabakh. But can you imagine that happening today?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Conor. That was fascinating. I'd like to ask you on the economic front what the performance of Russia economically has been. I mean, you mentioned that certain cities have modernized and are attractive places now, and the growth of the middle class as well. But in terms of economic growth, is the situation better than under the Soviet Union?
The sanctions have hurt Russia and have slowed down economic performance, mainly because with the sanctions and the threat of more sanctions, foreign investment in Russia has slowed down. I'm not really in a position to give you an accurate account of the Soviet economy at the moment, but I will say this, that I have seen the effect of the sanctions in a positive way. During the Soviet Union times, people loved to buy stuff from the West, and they had oil money, so they tended not to manufacture their own cheeses or their own fine wines or their own fashionable materials, garments. They tended to look to the West for the good shoes. Because of the sanctions, and people in the middle class have got used to a higher standard of living with eating nice cheeses from Italy, or that you now have enterprises in Russia manufacturing the goods that they were buying from abroad. So you now have the growth, and it's helping the economy, of homegrown industries manufacturing things that they were used to buying from abroad. But I think the growth rate in Russia is nothing like that of China. As I said, the infrastructure is lagging behind modern Europe and China. I can see for myself that a city like Moscow or Krasnoyarsk is full of life, pulsing with life, and there's money there from minerals and timber, etc. But in the village where my wife's family have their dacha, it's called Bilanovka. 20 years ago, that village had one shop, and there's never anything in it. And it's still the same today, and the people there are still impoverished. So the economy has not helped vast swathes of rural Russia, but the cities are thriving.
Just a supplementary question, a specific question. You mentioned the privatization program and the voucher system and so on. What became of the collective farms?
What became of the collective farms?
I don't know if can I use a bad word in this this trip. I'll tell you an interesting story about collective farms. I was on a holiday on the River Shannon. This is a story of how aware people in Ireland are of what was going on in Russia compared to people I've met in other countries. I was on a boat in the Shannon, and I was walking up to the village to get the breakfast, and it rained, and I took shelter under a tree, and the lockkeeper was there, plus an old peasant farmer, his trousers tied up with string, and he was about 80 years old, and he was a farmhand. And the lockkeeper got out from me that I worked in Russia. We were in a conversation. And he said to me, "Do you mind if I ask you a question?" This is the old fellow. And I said, "No." He said, "Is it true that collectivization is fucked?" And therein there's a whole body of knowledge there in that man, which I've always thought was very revealing. And I'm sure that word has never been used in this church before. So as regards collectivization, the problem with collectivization was that the peasants knew how to work the land before collectivization. And over time, that knowledge was lost, the knowledge of how to plough a field. For example, during collectivization, you were punished if your plough broke. You couldn't get petrol for your plough, so you ploughed very shallow furrows and the crops suffered. So the collective farms were a bit of a disaster. The knowledge of farming was not there when the Soviet Union collapsed, so it was a very slow process of finding, returning the land to private ownership, which has happened with the voucher system that I described. So you do have the emergence now of proper farms. And indeed, some Irish people have gone over to former Soviet parts of the Soviet Union, like Estonia, to breed cattle. But the Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian farmers never really adopted collectivization. But in the vast swathes of rural Russia, it's still a problem. It's still a problem.
Hello. Just curious, what role does the Orthodox Church play in the life of Russia today?
What is the role of the Orthodox Church?
Yeah. Please.
Very interesting. In communist times, the Orthodox Church was barely tolerated. Krasnoyarsk, for example, had about 12 churches before the revolution and was allowed to keep only one, and only old people went there. If you were a civil servant or a teacher and you went there to service, you lost your job. It's as simple as that. There's been a fantastic turnaround. If you are in any city in Russia now on Easter Sunday, you don't greet each other by saying hello. You greet each other by saying Christ is risen, and the other person will say, indeed, he is risen. Christos voskres. And that's a common greeting now among people who even still yearn for the old communist ways. Putin has embraced the Russian Orthodox Church and made it the official church to such an extent that he is now embraced by the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church. And it has become so identified with the Russian state that the Russian Orthodox Church branch in Ukraine has just, in the last month, broken off relationships with the church in Russia because the Russian church has become such an identity with nationalism in Russia. So, you know, in the Kremlin, you have services every Sunday. You have people now are returning, not in large numbers, but returning to the faith, the Russian Orthodox faith. But it is very much identified with the Kremlin.
With regard to Vladimir Putin, I'm trying to remember exactly how many terms as Russian president he was allowed. I think it was 2. And then Medvedev went in and he served, and now Vladimir Putin is back again. Considering his age profile, where do you see the leadership of Russia going over the next, I don't know, 30 years? And is there anything in the shadows that might challenge him? I've been reading a little bit about, I may have the incorrect pronunciation, Navalny, you know, who does a lot of protesting, and he has certain groups around him, but again, the feeling I get is that he doesn't really have, in the entire Russia, he doesn't really have that much support, and which is probably backed up by the fact that Putin is so popular there.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, I think Putin is very afraid of an orange revolution. There have been occasions when Navalny has been able to bring protesters out, protesting against corruption, which is a common complaint in this new middle class in Russia. Navalny enjoys a certain amount of freedom, but he can't stand for the presidency because he was put in prison on trumped-up charges for a few weeks, and that means you're automatically disqualified, which is a clever way of managed democracy from Putin's point of view. He doesn't show any signs of aging very much. The question of, I don't think he's all that secure in the Kremlin. I've read accounts of how there's a power play going on all the time with oligarchs and people with circles of power. He cannot voluntarily stand down because just like Yeltsin appointed him and they promised that Yeltsin wouldn't be prosecuted, he has no guarantee that whoever came next wouldn't pillory him and charge him with corruption. You know, I think he's there for the indefinite future, but there is always that danger that some spark might ignite, and Navalny's call for people to come on the streets will actually result in a bigger demonstration than we have seen so far against his rule. But you know, people say that the Russians are apathetic, and we can see this apathy. But during the last years of the Soviet Union, that apathy disappeared, and the streets became, you know, you couldn't walk the streets but for demonstrations taking place and people making speeches. And that could happen again. There's no sign of it at the moment happening, though there have been protests, but there's no sign of mass protests.
I just have a question on, I was reading recently, looking at statistics, and it was internet connectivity, and that Russia was right up at the very top of the league tables. And you mentioned how Russian infrastructure is lagging way behind China, but this seems to be something that's something of a focus, so just wondering, could you comment on that? And then the second part of the question is what sort of online civil society there is in Russia, whereas in China it would be heavily censored, the online environment, but I don't get a sense that that's the same in Russia.
So one about the whole internet connectivity within Russia, and second, maybe the implications that has for an online civic society.
Yeah, there's interconnectivity on a scale that we haven't achieved yet in Ireland. At the Dacha, 80 kilometers north of Krasnoyarsk, in a very isolated part of what's called the taiga, the last few miles are a dirt road. And I can sit there and read the Irish Times in the morning. I can read the Washington Post, I can send emails, I can access anything I want, because the whole, well, the villages are still in the same state they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. Where there are dachas with city people living, there is interconnectivity. As regards the effect on civil society, that's a very interesting question. There is, by and large, an ability to access whatever you want in Russia. In fact, I watched something on YouTube which is available in Russia. It was a documentary that Navalny put together on the corruption, corruption. I'm trying to think of the deputy to Putin. His name just escapes me at the moment.
Putin's deputy?
Medvedev, yes, that's the one I'm trying to think of, sorry. He has built for himself huge mansions in the south of Russia. And Navalny used one of these devices to film from above and put all this on the internet and said, look, here's a man whose salary is such and such. How is it that he owns such a mansion? How is it that he is able to employ people? How is he able to buy these Persian carpets? And how is he able to dig the swimming pool? So there is, people can look at that on the internet, and there is a lot of subversion goes on. And people can read the Western newspapers as well. It's not like in China. In China, you cannot do that. China, everything is blocked, which is rather ironic.
Yeah. Great. As a Killaloo resident, I am very envious of Russian internet connectivity.
Just one quick question. Well, can I just ask you how you think the position of women currently in Russia compares to that of the experience of women in the USSR, perhaps coming towards the final days of the USSR?
The position of women in general, I think, within Russian society?
Yes.
Yeah, how that has developed.
Women have enjoyed more equality in Russian society than historically here. For example, Zhana's mother, Marietta, she worked in this shoe factory, 800 people. She was head of the Communist Party in the shoe factory. She was head of the shoe factory trade union, and she was number 2 to the boss. There's always been a male dominance culture in Russia, but women have traditionally taken on senior roles, certainly in education. I know this is a hot topic here, the number of women here who can't get full professorships. In Russia, it's probably the other way around. But you do see women doing labouring jobs much more than here. When the snow has to be cleared in the winter, it's the babushka who's out with the shovel. Has it changed? Yes, I honestly couldn't say, but just in my own observation, I do see women occupying senior posts, and but I think it's probably still much the same as in the West.
We'll take one final question, David.
It's just my own question. You hear about the Russian meddling in the American elections and things like that, and obviously Putin would love to see the dismantlement of Europe as an entity, European experiment. Is there any evidence that he's been meddling in European countries, or even meddling in something like the Brexit debate?
Sorry, I can't hear the microphone.
Yeah, so just a question about the degree to which Putin might be meddling in the European political world,
yeah,
not just the American.
Yeah. Well, Montenegro has recently just stopped a coup by Russian KGB agents. The Macedonia has a problem with Russian agents trying to prevent Macedonia from joining NATO, and became involved in the name change controversy. Here, closer to home, this gentleman called Banks, who put 8 million into the Leave, the independent Leave campaign. There are investigations going on into where that 8 million came from, and the word Russia has been mentioned. I'm only repeating what I see on Channel 4, it's the most trustworthy news service. I can't say any more than that. Certainly they meddled in the United States, absolutely no doubt about that. And I think the hold they have on Trump is not to do with prostitutes or anything, it's to do with money. But certainly, if one looks at cause and effect, the effect of what's happening with Brexit and in America, one looks for the causes, and I think you'll find Russia there among the causes.
Okay. Conor, I think.
Just one last one, if you don't mind. The last bit to that conversation. You know, when the Iron Curtain came down, one of the guarantees that they got was that NATO wouldn't move into that perimeter area. And yet we've insisted on taking missiles that can go several thousand miles and move them right up to the Russian border. Yeah. And again, this not fuel Putin's, I'm trying to be an apologist for, but fuel that paranoia that he innately has anyway.
Yeah. No, I agree. And if you look at it, the narrative from inside Russia, you see this threatening world, where of course NATO is not threatening anybody, but they see it as threatening. And mind you, I have mixed feelings about the NATO expansion to the border, because I did a lot of my reporting in the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And they are very aware of the fact that they have a very large, aggressive neighbour. And if I was an Estonian, I would love to have Estonia as a member of NATO. I can see the reason why the expansion of NATO to Russia is maybe not a bad thing from the point of view of bringing stability, and that Russia now knows that if it's tempted to do with the Baltic states what it did with Crimea, that they're playing in a very dangerous game. So, no, but you're right, the narrative from inside Russia is that the world is trying to get them with sanctions and all sorts of conspiracy theories.
I was born in the Soviet Union, and of course, everything you were talking about is really true. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. Yeah, but my question is, how do you think living in Russia for such a long time is there a real threat? We were always told we want peace. Would Russia actually start the Third World War?
So is Russia now likely to be the initiator of global conflict?
No, the short answer is no. No, I hope not. But I can't see, global conflict will probably come about by accident, as it nearly did in 1983. I can't see Russia taking any more aggressive actions, certainly not against NATO or NATO country. There may be crises in the future, but I don't see either NATO or Russia commencing a conflict. And there are still lots of contacts between the two. But what I do see is Russia extending its influence in the areas where America and Britain used to be power brokers. And I'm talking about the Middle East and Syria, where Vladimir Putin has been very strategically focused and has managed to make Russia a power broker. And I think Russia's far more interested, Putin's far more interested in doing that rather than starting a conflict, which it could only be awful. Спасибо.
Just on that point, what is the relationship between Russia and China at present?
The relationship between Russia and China is uneasy friendship. There used to be a lot of tension between Russia and China. I don't detect that it's there now to the same extent. But interestingly, in Krasnoyarsk, in the airport, the signs are in two languages, Russian and Chinese. And there are a lot of Chinese moving into Russia to buy up holiday homes along the shores of Lake Baikal, for example. So there's interaction going on there. I don't detect any great power, dangerous great power tensions.
Do you want to stand up? Sorry, the relationship between Angela Merkel and Sorry, Conor. The relationship between Angela Merkel and Putin.
If I could do it, I would show you a photograph that I have on my mobile. It's a photograph of Merkel on her first visit to the Kremlin. You know, Merkel doesn't like dogs. She can't stand a dog being in the room. And this photograph is of Putin sitting here and Merkel sitting here. And Putin has brought in a large black dog, which is growling at Merkel. And she's sitting there like this, terrified. And he's sitting there like this. That sums up the way he treated Merkel at the start. And I think that the relationship never really became warm. Merkel had enough authority to go to him and help arrange some sort of a ceasefire in Ukraine and some sort of arrangement to stop the conflict spreading. He doesn't like what she stands for and she doesn't like what he stands for. And I think that the relationship was never any warmer than that one I've described. It was Alistair Campbell gave me that photograph, by the way. He was giving a speech in Dublin with Quentin Peel, was chairing it. He was here last week, and he was talking to Quentin and me, and he said, "Here's sums up the relationship between Merkel and Putin." Sorry?
Back to the Second World War, is that just historic animosity?
Yeah, well, yes and no. I mean, obviously there's the memory there. There's the fact that millions of Russians died fighting the Nazis. There's wariness, I suppose, because of that. There's also the fact that a lot of the poison was taken out of that Second World War aftermath by the fact that East Germany became a communist state. And Merkel, of course, came from East Germany. So there should have a certain understanding of the relationship with Russia. And the fact that East Germany and Germans became part of the extended Soviet area, the Warsaw Pact, helped mitigate take away some of the poison, I believe.
Okay, I am going to bring it to a close now. Just by saying something, Conor, along these lines, I think it is often said that the quality of a talk can be assessed by the quality of the questions that it prompts and the range of questions. I think from the range of topics that people have raised, you can take it that from their perspective and from mine, this has been an absolute tour de force. And we have only touched Russia. Like, we haven't mentioned your time in the States, we haven't mentioned your time in Beijing, and in so many other capacities. Just on behalf of David, on behalf of the Limerick Civic Trust, on behalf of everybody here, and on my own behalf, I just thank you for an absolutely fantastic presentation, and thank you for taking the time to come to Limerick to talk to us.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you. Thank you very much.